I have no plans for this episode. I have notes, but no plans. I should move the notes to where I can see them. Hello, and welcome back to I Don't Imagine Anyone's Listening, the podcast where I talk about whatever I want to talk about because I do not imagine that anyone is listening. I really didn't think that title through when I picked it. I just thought it was kind of funny, but I'm stuck with it now. Anyway, I am your host, Monica Marie Durr, writer, editor, podcaster. Now, it's a title that you can give yourself, and as I like to say, certified internet nobody. Today, we are continuing our journey through the liturgical year and through the works of Tolkien. It is Lent, and so I decided last year that my Lent thing is that I read Lord of the Rings. I mean, there's many Lent things, but one of my Lent things is that I read Lord of the Rings, so this is the second year that I've done that. And you know what? It's good every time. We'll get into it, but I thought, I read it last year, and it had been a few years, and I'm like, oh, it's still good. And then when I decided I was going to do it again this year, I was like, I don't know if I'm going to like it again, because I've read them relatively recently, but no, it holds up. It's good every single time. I like it every time of the 2 times that I've done this. Anyway, so I know we're quite late in Lent, and we're only doing Fellowship of the Ring. Did I mention that? We're talking about Fellowship of the Ring. But I was prepared to do this last week, and then I didn't get around to recording it. So good news, I am about a third of the way into Two Towers. So if I really buckle down, we can do that one for Holy Week, because I know myself. I will not have it done next week, but the week after, maybe. Anyway, this time we're talking about the Fellowship of the Ring, and when I know people who love Lord of the Rings, we get very defensive when people say they don't like it, or they don't like reading the books, even if they like the movies, because it's a good story, but the books are not for everyone, and I think we all have to acknowledge that, because, oh my gosh, this book is kind of boring. It takes a really long time to get going, a really long time. Chapter 1, good stuff, very important information, but then, until you get to, Rivendell? No, Bree. That's not fair. Until you get to Bree, there's a gap a chunk of 3 or 4 chapters that just don't really matter. And I'm not just talking about Tom Bombadil, though I am largely talking about Tom Bombadil. Yeah, he's amazing, and I know within sort of the wider... Well, no one, he's sort of a weird outlier, and there's lots of debate that I'm just not interested in about whether he's important and what his role is in the whole universe and blah, 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 whatever. He's pointless. He doesn't need to be in the book. I don't understand. I do understand, but also, why? It's totally pointless. He doesn't need to be there. He has no bearing. They mention him occasionally throughout, he pops up in the Council of Elrond, because they're like, well, maybe we can just leave the ring at his house, and they're like, no, that's not gonna work. But, he doesn't need to be there. He's sort of an interesting, what is this thing? But, okay, I've gone on for quite some time about him not needing to be in this book. But it's not just him, the whole Crick Hollow chapter. I get why they cut that out of the movie. I quite enjoy it, but it doesn't have a lot of bearing. Old Forest. The Baradowns are very cool, but again, you cut them out of the film, you don't really miss a whole lot. It's just Aragorn has a bunch of small swords and no one asks any questions, so... But that's not what I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to acknowledge if there's any listeners out there who are like, yeah, I like Lord of the Rings, or I want to like reading this book, but it's just hard to get into. I understand. I feel your pain. I find it much easier to read now that I've read them multiple times, but the first one is tough to get into. And every time I have that experience of the first 100 pages or so, it's rough. I have notes, but I find when I take notes, I don't have a point. I just wrote down a bunch of stuff that I liked or I noticed. So I don't know, maybe I'll just read these out and maybe a point will emerge. Oh, I keep smacking that. It's a problem when you talk with your hands and you have a relatively small space to record. You just hit things and then you don't, unless you want to re-record what you just said, you just have to leave the noises in. Anyway, it's a little inside baseball for y'all. The first thing I wrote down. So there's a lot of stuff in, when you read a book many times, there's little things that you notice that you didn't notice before or didn't really have any significance to you before. Coffee. And so the first thing, it's quite early on in the book. So Bilbo disappears after his birthday party, and Frodo's left to hand out bequeaths and presents to friends and relatives. And I never noticed, or it didn't click, that the little notes that Bilbo leaves on the presents for people are really passive aggressive. And it really cracked me up reading it this time. Like he gives a cousin or something, I'm just going to assume that these are all cousins of some kind, named Adelard Took. He gives him an umbrella for his very own because this particular Adelard had carried off many unlabeled umbrellas. Oh, there's one called Milo Burrows. And Bilbo gave him a very nice pen and ink bottle, hoping it will be useful. Milo never answers letters. This one. I mean, okay, there's obviously Lobelia in the spoons because there's the thing at the end of The Hobbit where she tries to take all of his spoons in her umbrella, and that really made me laugh. But that one people remember. But the penultimate one is for Hugo Bracegirdle. First of all, a great name. And he gives him an empty bookcase because Hugo was a great borrower of books and was worse than usual at returning them. And I get that. If you've ever loaned me a book, you know it's gonna be quite some time before you see it again. Even if I've already read it, I will just forget to give it back to you. So that, I feel you, Hugo. You're one of my people. That made me laugh. And I don't know why. I mean, I'm sure it made me chuckle previous times, but this time I remembered it. Possibly because I wrote it down. Anyway, so last year when I read this book, I had, a different experience of reading it because it had been many years since I've read it. And I remember as a kid being like, oh, the Council of Arwen's kind of rough to get through. But then reading it again, I was like, oh, this is actually better than I remembered. So last year I had a thought, I'm like, oh, I could do an episode on not the whole book, but just in defense of the Council of Elrond. So I'm going to take a moment to do that now. And because it's a lot more interesting than I remember. There's more going on in there, possibly because I know more things and I'm aware of more background and I remember who's who, possibly. But anyway, it's better than I remember. So most of my notes come from that one or two chapters that it takes up. I forgot that at the beginning of it, when Gandalf is walking Frodo and Bilbo over to the castle and Sam's with them, and he's not invited, but he immediately, that's not a surprise. He immediately goes and hides in the bushes so that he can listen. He invites himself from the get-go, which I think is great. And it's good. And so other than that, so the council itself is really good. It does the background, broad strokes of the history of the ring very well with the forging of it and the elves and Sauron back in the day. Some of the stuff the Rings of Power show is trying to cover. Regardless of your feelings on that, it was kind of, having watched that show, it was kind of cool to read this and be like, oh, okay, I see where they're getting some of their stuff. So that was kind of cool. But then, Isildur and it betraying him and him getting, if falling in the river and dying and losing the ring before Gollum finds it, blah, 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 blah. So that's stuff we know. But I thought that was cool. So it is a big old exposition dump. That's tougher to say than I thought it would be. You do get some interesting character stuff specifically for Boromir and Frodo, because you see that Frodo is the wheels are starting to turn. He's like, oh, I see where this is going, and oh shit, it's gonna have to be me. And then you also see Boromir going, oh, I see where this is going, but this is where I think it should be going. And so right away he's not on board with the mission, but he still gets himself in there because he thinks he can change people's minds or forcibly convince them to go his way, which is interesting. And also I noticed that Aragorn is not the first of Isildur's heirs to live in Rivendell. There was one called Valandil who was there, I think during the big old battle where they take the ring from Sauron. I think that's one, but I just thought that was interesting. That's something I hadn't noticed before. It's there you go. Look at you having your made-up history repeat itself. Also because everyone, of course, most people are familiar with the movies. I, of course, am very familiar with the movies. So you notice the differences, in the movie, there's this sort of, Aragorn has this sort of unwilling king thing going on there, greatness thrust upon them type of deal. But in the book, he's all in. He knows. He's yeah, I was born to do this, and this is my time, baby. They reforge the sword right at the beginning. He's ready to go. He's yeah, this is, I'm gonna go be king. This is the time. And he does not need to be convinced. I thought that puts him in an entirely different light, and it changes a lot about the story just as a whole, which is very interesting. They're very cagey about the Seven Rings. Switching gears entirely. There's the Seven Rings for the Dwarf Lords. Very cagey about what happened to them. Glowin seems to know, but he's just does not want to answer that question, and no one presses him on it. So I'm I don't know. Just is there? I mean, I'm gonna attempt to read some of the non Lord of the Rings lore stuff, so maybe I'll find out eventually. So no spoilers if you know, but like maybe let me know if I'm gonna find out. Anyway, let's see. So someone else, I was listening to The Book Pile, which is a different podcast about books, and one of the hosts of that show, which you should go listen to, it's much better than this one. Listen to this one first and then go listen to that one. You'll like that one too. They read Lord of the Rings, and in their Fellowship of the Ring episode, one of the hosts mentioned that he thought it was funny that when Saruman says that he has become Sauron of many colors, Gandalf is just kind of sarcastic, and he's like, I liked white better. And I was like, yeah, that is kind of funny. And so then in my notes, so I would remember to mention that, I wrote Saruman in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Because I know when I did The Hobbit, I talked a lot about that cartoon from the 70s. So I think either a little bit later in the 70s, possibly in the early 80s, a different production company or different artists or both made a Lord of the Rings cartoon that only covered Fellowship and the Two Towers. And maybe when we do the Two Towers, I'll watch that and talk about that a bit more. And so there's, in that scene, he's got this like shimmery like rainbow robe thing going on, and that image is hard to shake. But the other thing about this that I really noticed is Gandalf is like, we don't have a lot of time. Let's be brief. My story is very long. Also, arguably his is like the most interesting because he's got, he gets captured by another wizard, and then he gets picked up by an eagle. He gets picked up by eagles a lot. And then, he goes and gets that like amazing horse. And I love Shadowfax. He's a great horse. I was never a horse girl, but I like that horse in particular. So he's like, I'm going to cut the chase. I'm going to give you the, TLDR version. But then he's also like, here, let me tell you word for word a conversation I had with Gaffer Gamgee, and I'm just like, dude, pick a lane. Or don't. Actually, I'm a big fan of Gaffer Gamgee. Those are my thoughts on the Council of Elrond. I don't know if I had a point other than it's better than I remember. There's actually a lot of interesting stuff. I like a good scene where they sit and talk, and you get introduced to a lot of characters, including Legolas. That's the first time you get to interact with him, and you do see some of the sort of tension between the races, and because you're basically Frodo in this scene, you don't know any of this stuff, really, and so you're coming into it cold, and you don't understand why these people don't like each other. It's cool. It's a better, I know people are like, yes, this is one of the greatest fantasy books of all times. It basically invented the genre. But then we don't really go into why. And this chapter really is, I think, is a good example of why. It's that it is a ton of exposition, but it sets up the entire trilogy halfway through the first book. It gives you a lot of lore and backstory, and some of the, it's not quite political because that's not really how this world functions, but you do understand the sort of historical tensions. It does do a lot of world building and exposition while still like putting you in and kicking off the actual story, which, to be fair, it's like 200 pages in, and oh man, I wish he had done it a little faster. But you do see really how good he is at crafting this world and how much thought and time and energy went into building this whole universe, basically. So I thought that was very cool. And I think this particular chapter gets a bit of a bad rap. And if you're one of those people like me who likes to reread these books a lot, or it's been a bit and you'd like to go back to them, or you've never read them before, maybe keep that in mind when you get to the Council of Elrond. But also, if you get bored at the beginning, don't feel bad. It's a tough read. You'll get into my fresh new perspective on the Two Towers when we get to the Two Towers, because I used to think that one was hard to read, and I have since changed my mind. But anyway, so I do have a couple other things, just random thoughts about things, and I just feel like they need to bring them up. There's two quotes that I feel like are very relatable. One is about Frodo. One Sam said to himself. It was about Frodo, you get it very on in the earlier on in the book, and then the one from Sam is like all the way at the end. So at one point, Frodo is described as neither very fat nor very timid, and that's like goals. That's like what you want to be, right? You want to be in that sweet spot of not too fat, not too scared. And like I had an episode before where I talked about representation and how I've always really identified with Frodo, and I felt very represented by him, and that's part of why these especially, like, he does such a good job with the whole Hobbit thing, partially because, like, he is sort of writing the people, definitely writing the people that he knows, but also, like, you know these people and you are these people. It's great. I'm, like, jumping all the way to the end. Just because I, too, am not a tall person. So Sam, it's at the very end, Red Diamond Hen. There's orcs everywhere. Everyone's running around. We don't know where Frodo went. Aragorn's like, Sam, keep up. And obviously Sam can't keep up because Aragorn's a very tall man. Like, that's his nickname is Strider because he's got big old long legs. And Sam is he's a little person. So he says, your legs are too short, so use your head. And that's just good advice. Even if you are, you know, of at least average height, it's good advice. If your legs are too short, use your head. And your legs being too short can be a metaphor for whatever's holding you back. But that's just good. It's really good. I don't have any context for this, but there's a thing, I think it's a place, it's called Wetwang. It makes me laugh every single time. I know he didn't mean it that way, but in case you didn't hear it, it is called Wetwang, and it's funny every time, and I am a child. Yeah, this is so disjointed. Every time I do this, I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna have a format and I'm gonna be coherent, and then I don't. Formats are not for me, my friends. If you were hoping for something structured and coherent, you've come to the wrong place. I can promise a moderate intelligence, but I think that's the best I can do, and even that might be pushing it. My coffee's getting cold. I'm gonna drink some. Anyway, I'm leaving that in. Another thing about these books that I thought is very cool and I didn't appreciate before is that even though, yeah, it's fantasy epic, it does cover a lot of genres. You know, like you get some of the sort of, like in the council, you get some sort of, not quite political, but you get some interpersonal stuff. You get, when you're with the hobbits, you get some, you know, it's just sort of like slice of life, which is it's kind of nice. And then when, it happens later on, like in Two Towers, but you get some love story stuff going on. It's like, it's very, like, you know, he has sort of the breadth of human experience. And so it covers a lot more genres than just fantasy epic. But one that I had sort of forgotten was there is some real, like, proper, like, horror movie stuff. And it's specifically with the Black Riders at the beginning. And they reproduce this sort of in the movie, because the Black Riders in the movies are very creepy. They're really well done, especially that scene where they're like under that tree root and it's right above them sniffing. That scene still freaks me out. I love it. But when I can't remember, I should have written down when it was, but I think it's after they cross the river, like after they meet up with Farmer Maggot and they cross the river with the ferry and Mary meets them, and or maybe it's before. Anyway, but at one point, the Black Rider is off his horse, and they just see, like, a black shape, like, scrabbling at a distance away, and it's so creepy. Also, I tend to read quite late at night, so it's like 1 a.m, and I'm reading this, and I'm like, oh, that's much scarier than I recall. That stuff, it's very good. Like, especially the Black Riders in particular are very scary at the beginning when they're on horses, and then they get off their horses and they just sort of like, they're just these kind of shapes and you can't really make out what they are, and it's spooky. It's real spooky. Speaking of Black Riders, because, you know, the movies are what sticks in your brain more, well, for me anyway. You think of the fell beasts as you don't see them until much later on. So, you know, the riders lose their horses after that whole thing with the river, different river. There's a lot of rivers, you know, right before Rivendell, and they do some magic in the river and they wash them all away and they're unhorsed, but then you think of when they get their new mounts, they're those, I don't know, they look kind of dinosaur-like, well, not quite. Anyway, there's big old lizard thingies. You associate that with Frodo and Sam on their way to Mordor and them being, but they turn up way sooner. It's before, I think this is before they even get to the waterfall after Lothlorien, when they're floating down the Great River. And, they see it from afar and Legolas shoots it down, and that's a fell beast. Like, I totally forgot that the winged Black Riders turn up again at the end of Fellowship. It does not wait until later on. As a sort of present danger, they are much more present than I remembered. But then to return to this being a tough book to read, or a tough book to get into, I think may be more accurate. So getting to the end of it, so you associate, again, you think of the ending of the movie, and it's, it's a good stopping point, Frodo and Sam go off to go to Mordor alone together. Merry and Pippin get captured, and Boromir dies, and that's the end. Is really that's our final sort of, that's our emotional climax, is Boromir dying. But the end of the book is so anticlimactic. It just stops. You don't get like a cliff. I mean, kind of, it is a cliffhanger in the sense that it just sort of lies like, and we're done. Tune in next time. We don't know what happened to Merry and Pippin. They're just gone. Like, we don't know that the orcs took them. Or no, we do know that the orcs took them, because Boromir does. No, we don't, because this is my point. Hang on. I'm going to reference the book, because it's right in front of me, and I should do that before I get something wrong. But I want to say that Boromir does not die at the end of this book. Breaking the Fellowship. Here we go. Frodo and Sam. Boromir hesitates. Whoops. No, Boromir doesn't die. No. That's when Boromir comes back, and just down the hill after, yelling at Frodo, and then, and he's like, I said some stuff, and Aragorn does not press him, and yeah, so he doesn't die at the end of this book. He dies at the beginning of the next book. Yeah, the way this ends with Frodo and Sam crossing the river and going off on their own. So all of that stuff that we think of the climax of the Fellowship of the Ring is the beginning of the Two Towers. So this one is just like, he just leaves us, and he's like, yep, they went. And I mean, yes, it is about Frodo, so we know what Frodo's up to, or we know where Frodo's off to, and so it stops. But it's just, there's nothing. There's just like, yeah, it's just like, and we'll pick this up in the next book. So I can't imagine reading this as they were being published and being like, but that's it. And then I guess that's an incentive to pick up the next one. I have no idea. But I also noticed that, like, so they're towards the end of this book, they go, oh yeah, we're entering the last stage of the quest. The last stage of the quest is the next 2 books. All of the action takes place in the next 2 books. So there's that. I think if I had a point in this episode, or something flirting with the edges of the point, is that all you people who are like, yeah, I like Lord of the Rings, but I've never read the books, or I started them and I never finished them, or I just couldn't, whatever. I feel it. Like, I love these books. I love them so much, but also I totally understand you. I get you. I will do my best not to fault you or be like, I don't understand why you can't get into them, because I absolutely can. And if in the, relatively recent past I have expressed opposite feelings, I retract them and I apologize. But still, I know I have not given like a glowing review of this book, even though I've said many times that I love it, but like, it's good and you should read it. And you're gonna, and like, I know it's not a great thing to say about a book that you kind of have to power through. Like, it's like when someone says, oh, you should really watch this show, but you have to power through the first season. You're like, I shouldn't have to power through the first season. You kind of, I think you should. I think it's worth it. I'm going to try to end encouragingly. If you've not read this book before, or if you've never been able to finish it, you can do it. I believe in you. It is totally worth it, because, as we will get into next time, The Two Towers is actually really good. I think it might be my favorite of the 3, despite the movie being the worst one. And it's still a great film. So, I'm going to end there, because this has gone on for longer than I ever expected. This might be my longest episode yet. Thanks for sticking around to the end, if you stuck around to the end. Next time, we will talk about The Two Towers, and hopefully that will be relatively soon, because I am quite motivated to get that out during Holy Week. I know Holy Week's not technically a liturgical season, but I'm still gonna give it its own thing, instead of being like Lent 1, Lent 2, which is what I should have done if I had done this last week like I intended to. You don't need to hear about my failings in personal discipline, and yet I'm not going to cut that bit out. Is it because I'm lazy? Is it because I'm desperate for content? Yes, all of the above. That's this episode. Thank you for listening. As I've said many times, next time we will do The Two Towers, and I don't know if we'll have a point then either, but I'll have things to say. Wow, I've passed the half-hour mark. Well, in the raw recording, I don't think it will actually be that long when I cut out all the ums and ers and awkward breaths and long pauses while I tried to collect my thoughts. Yep, so if you enjoyed this, there are other episodes. You can listen to those. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. I recently flirted with some social media. I don't want to say advertising because that's not accurate. Self-promotion. I put out a little clip of some of my terrible poetry for World Poetry Day earlier this week. You can find that on Twitter and Instagram, which the links for that are in the episode notes. I think I got a download for that episode by doing that. So, yay! Well done, me. Yeah. It's a good thing that I do this largely for my own amusement and don't have expectations of getting a wide audience. But I'm having fun, and I hope you're having fun. Subscribe. Tell your friends if you want. If you don't, I understand. I, too, am embarrassed by this. And yet I'm going to put it out there on the internet and tell people about it. Follow me on social media. You can support me financially, but if you'd prefer to support me spiritually and emotionally, that's okay, too. All right. I'm going to call this. This is getting out of hand. I will see y'all next time. I mean, I won't see you. This is an audio only format. Y'all will hear me next time. Okay, bye.